I remember that evening with a kind of clarity that belongs only to things one would rather forget. Oxford has a way of turning its own stones into mirrors, and as I crossed the old quad at Brasenose, I felt the familiar ache of being watched by the past. Twilight sat low on the walls, smudging the sky into a color difficult to name, and the air smelled of chilled stone and the stale breath of old libraries. I had no case, no urgency, no reason to be there beyond the restless instinct that drives a man back to places he swears he has outgrown. It was the chalk that stopped me first. Thin blue lines, some straight and others veering in hesitant curves, stretched across the paving stones as though a child had been tracing secret routes no one else could see. I crouched the way a man does when his knees protest louder than his curiosity, and ran a finger over one of the strokes. Dry. Recently. Too precise to be the idle scrawl of students still half drunk from the turf. The line pointed toward the porter's lodge, then broke off abruptly, as if the drawer had been startled. Lewis's voice arrived behind me like a cold draught. He said the porter, Martin Wells, had been found slumped over his small desk an hour earlier. Heart, most likely, though Lewis added the phrase with the heavy reluctance of someone who sensed I would refuse it. I stood there a moment, listening to the rain collect in the gutters above us. A line of chalk brushed against my shoe and left the faintest reminder of its presence. We walked to the lodge together. The door gave a complaining creak that felt too theatrical for the occasion, but death often turns the mundane into something faintly absurd. Wells sat in his chair as though sleep had surprised him mid-sentence. What struck me more than the body was the folded scrap of paper tucked into his coat. A torn page from the student register, a name scribbled over, another name written beneath. A small change, yet I have come to distrust small changes. They arrive disguised as trivialities, but years of this work have taught me the ruin hidden in smallness. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him I disliked coincidences, especially those that involve shadows on wet stone and a dead man with altered paperwork. He didn't argue. He rarely does when I adopt that impossible tone I later regret. Back outside, the evening had settled into a deeper kind of quiet. A window somewhere in the upper rooms clicked shut, though the sound might have been a bird tapping the glass. Oxford is full of noises that never explain themselves. I stood at the center of the quad, following the chalk lines with my eyes. They made no coherent picture, not then. A fractured map, a broken geometry. Lines that invited understanding but withheld it with the stubbornness of a half-remembered dream. I told Lewis there was something wrong with the shape of it all. He said it was probably nothing. He is a good man, but sometimes he mistakes my silences for exaggeration. What I felt in that moment was neither exaggeration nor intuition. It was the faint beginning of a pattern pressing against the edges of my mind, insisting I pay attention. The last of the daylight slid behind the chapel roof, leaving the blue lines fainter but somehow more insistent. I walked across them carefully, as though stepping on a message I had not yet been permitted to read, and felt the first cold breath of the case waiting just beyond the dark. It is a peculiar truth of police work that some deaths slip far too easily into the world's quiet acceptance. Martin Wells was one of those men whose passing seemed to inconvenience no one, and perhaps that was what unsettled me most as Lewis and I walked the rain-dark corridor leading to the room where they had set him down. The air smelled faintly of paraffin and old paper, the sort of odor that clings to places where time has learned to move reluctantly. A constable nodded towards us, but his expression carried that familiar mixture of pity and disinterest that accompanies an unremarkable corpse. I remember standing beside the narrow bed where Wells lay, noticing how peaceful he looked. A man worn by years of quiet servitude rarely dies with such tidy composure. My eyes fell upon the dampness at the edges of his trousers, a soft watermark that spoke of recent exposure to wet stone. Lewis muttered that he must have stepped outside before collapsing. I told him the night had been dry, and watched the doubt flicker through him like the dimming of a lamp. It was the smallest of contradictions, yet my mind has an undisciplined habit of circling such details long after others have turned away. Someone had set a newspaper beside the body. A crossword, half solved, lay folded open to reveal a single clue. Stone's line betrayal, a word of 5 letters, faintly penciled and half erased. Wells had always been fond of puzzles, but something about the emphasis of those 3 terms felt uncomfortably deliberate, as though he had wanted someone to see it. I traced the penciled strokes with a fingertip and felt the prickle of a thought still forming beyond the reach of certainty. When we stepped back into the quad, the rain had begun again in thin, indecisive threads. I watched the droplets darken the chalk lines on the stones, smudging them into wavering streaks. A hooded figure appeared on the CCTV stills Lewis held, captured crossing the quad at 2 a.m. The posture suggested youth, but posture is a deceitful informant. The figure's route aligned too neatly with the chalk's disrupted path, and I felt a tightening somewhere beneath my ribs. Lewis asked what I made of the timing. I told him timing is never accidental, even when it appears so. He laughed quietly, the sound softened by the drizzle, and said we were only hours into the case, and already I looked more troubled than the college authorities. I didn't tell him that what troubled me had little to do with the obvious elements. It was the sense that someone had prepared the stage too carefully. I dislike theatre disguised as coincidence. We spoke with Dr. Harriet Vane Foster shortly after. She met us at her door with the kind of composed sorrow that belongs to academics who have learned to fold their feelings into syntax. She said Wells had been loyal, discreet, uncomplaining. Her eyes drifted once towards the quad, where the chalk lines bled into the cracks between the stones, and something in her expression tightened before she recovered it. She asked if there was any suspicion. Lewis answered before I could, insisting it was too early to say. I watched her hands, one curled loosely around a book, the other resting against the doorframe, tapping a slow rhythm that felt involuntary. When we left her rooms, the evening light had thinned to a pale smear above the rooftops. I paused again beside the chalk, noticing how a few lines remained stubbornly intact despite the rain. They formed an angle that felt almost architectural, as though part of a larger shape hidden in plain sight. Lewis asked if I saw something. I told him not yet, though the truth was that something had begun to stir a faint geometry, a whisper of intention. The death of Martin Wells was a death nobody questioned, and that, more than anything, was why I could not let it go. There is a particular kind of indifference one encounters in Oxford culture, articulate and performed with the ease of people who have spent their lives convincing others that nothing can touch them. I have always found that the individuals who insist most loudly upon their composure are the very ones whose secrets bruise the deepest. That morning, the quad lay beneath a sullen sky, the chalk lines pale as old veins, and I found myself studying the faces of those who had already learned to pretend that Martin Wells' death was a footnote rather than an intrusion. Lewis and I began with Edwin Caldecott, the bursar. He welcomed us into his office with the tight smile of a man who believes politeness is a weapon. He spoke of Wells as dependable, predictable, utterly ordinary. But while he talked, I noticed his gaze flicking, almost involuntarily, toward a locked drawer in his desk. The movement was slightly a mere tremor of attention, but it had the unmistakable quality of fear. When I asked about his whereabouts the previous night, he answered quickly, almost rehearsed, insisting he had gone home early to work through financial reports. His fingertips drummed once on the wood, then stopped abruptly, as though he had revealed more of himself than intended. We next visited Dr. Harriet Vane Foster. Her rooms were dim, the curtains drawn against a light that never brightened. She apologized for the disorder, though the place was immaculate. Her voice carried that calm academic cadence that makes everything sound like analysis rather than confession. She spoke of Wells with an affection that was too carefully modulated. I noticed a single blue smudge on the hem of her skirt, a trace of chalk, almost invisible, the sort of detail one only sees when the mind is already troubled. When I asked about her last conversation with the porter, her eyes drifted to a book lying on her desk, its spine cracked in a way that suggested repeated readings of a single passage. She said it had been a trivial exchange about mail deliveries. I did not believe her, though I found no pleasure in the doubt. Cecily and Rowan came next, two postgraduate students whose relationship hovered in that fragile space between devotion and resentment. Cecily looked exhausted, her expression folded inward, as though she had been awake for hours, rehearsing the version of truth she would offer us. Rowan, by contrast, maintained the careless charm of a man accustomed to escaping consequences by virtue of confidence alone. When I asked where they had been at 2 a.m, Cecily answered before Rowan could, insisting they were together. Rowan's momentary glance toward her carried a weight I couldn't yet decipher. Gratitude, perhaps, or coercion, or the dull obedience of someone accustomed to letting another person shield him. As we left them, I told Lewis that Cecily's eagerness to protect Rowan felt too sharp-edged to be loyalty alone. He said young people often love unwisely. I reminded him that unwise love has been the root of more crimes than greed ever managed. Our final conversation was with Professor Alderton, whose years at the college had etched themselves across his voice in the form of an absent-minded lethargy. He declared the chalk markings part of an art installation proposed by a student committee. The explanation sounded plausible enough, yet something about the ease with which he offered it struck me as conveniently prepackaged. He gestured vaguely toward a stack of papers on his desk, claiming the proposal was somewhere within them, though he made no effort to retrieve it. I watched his hand as it rested atop the stack, fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. Fear again, not of us, but of some memory stirring beneath the surface. When we finally stepped back into the quad, the wind had begun to move through the cloisters with a low, wavering hum. The chalk lines, half faded, seemed to rearrange themselves with each shift of the light. I couldn't yet see the pattern, but the feeling persisted, a whisper of geometry, a suggestion of meaning that hovered at the threshold of recognition. Lewis asked if any of them seemed promising. I told him none of them cared enough, and that was precisely why I distrusted them. People pretend most fiercely when they wish their truths to remain unseen. And as I watched the quad stretch before me like a fractured manuscript, I knew that at least one of them was already rewriting the story of the night Martin Wells died. I woke the next morning with the familiar heaviness behind the eyes that comes not from whiskey, but from unresolved thought. Oxford had wrapped itself in a low mist that clung to the college roofs like unspoken regret. Lewis and I crossed the quad in silence, our footsteps dissolving into the dampness. Overnight rain had blurred the chalk lines into pallid streaks, yet even in their ruin, the pattern had not vanished. If anything, the thinning haze of color made it clearer where the hand that drew them had paused, reconsidered, or begun again. Near the porter's lodge, a new discovery waited for us. The chalk did not stop at the threshold as I had first assumed. A faint blue arc curved beneath the door, carried inside by a single boot or sleeve. When we stepped into the small, dim lodge, the quiet pressed down with a weight that felt almost devotional. On the flagstones just inside the doorway, untouched by the rain, a line of chalk continued upward, tracing the edge of the stair that led to the tiny loft above. Someone had drawn the continuation from memory, or else they had done so under cover of darkness and confidence. Lewis whispered that perhaps a child had wandered in, playing some private game. I told him children do not build their games from precise angles and parallel lines. These strokes had the hesitancy of a mind reaching for accuracy, not imagination. As I leaned closer, something else caught my eye. A single fingerprint smudged across the chalk, faint but unmistakable. It angled downward as though the person had steadied themselves against the wall. I brushed the air above it, unwilling to disturb something so delicate. When we stepped back outside, the mist had begun to thin. The lines on the stones near the chapel steps looked differently oriented now, as though the shifting light had decided to reveal what the night had hidden. I knelt and studied the angles, the widening curves. They were not random, nor merely decorative. The chalk traced the old boundaries of the college and the layout before the renovations of the late 80s. I felt the prickle of memory. Martin Wells had been here through all those years. He would have remembered the old plan intuitively. Lewis asked if I thought the markings were some kind of message. I told him messages are rarely this quiet, unless someone fears being overheard. He said the theory seemed stretched. I reminded him that truth often stretches long before it snaps. We walked toward the chapel. Even in daylight, it exuded that solemn hum of old stone, the kind that gathers every footstep into a low echo. At the base of the door, the chalk resumed in a fragmentary constellation. Someone had tried to scrub it away, but moisture had only blurred the edges. A single arrow, almost missed, pointed toward the small window that overlooked the vestry. I looked up, noticing how the glass reflected the milky sky in a way that made the room behind it unreadable. Lewis suggested we speak with the sexton. I agreed, though I was less interested in the church staff than in the layout of the quadrangle itself. It felt like a puzzle half-assembled, one of those cryptic crosswords that offers no foothold until a single elusive clue falls into place. I thought again of the word in Wells's unfinished crossword betrayal. A melodramatic term, but sometimes the melodramatic words are the truest. As we stepped back across the quad, a gust of wind disturbed the mist, revealing the lines more fully, like veins surfacing beneath pale skin. The map expanded in my mind an old memory, a new warning, or perhaps something else entirely. I felt that familiar flicker of unease, the knowledge that the outline of a truth had begun to press its shape against the surface of things. Lewis asked if I saw it now. I told him I wasn't sure. But I felt its presence, quiet and insistent, the soft geometry of someone trying to guide us, or to blame us, or to confess something they could not bring themselves to say aloud. There are moments in an investigation when the world arranges itself into an elegant lie, and for a brief time a detective almost wants to believe it. That morning held that particular flavor of deceit, a pale sun breaking through unsettled clouds, the quad looking almost innocent beneath its damp sheen, the sense that everything had shifted just enough to tempt the mind toward the wrong answer. Lewis joined me by the chapel steps, his breath fogging in the brittle air, and told me Cecily had come forward with something she described as troubling. People always use the word troubling when they mean guilty. We met her in the reading room, where the air smelled of old dictionaries and dust that had learned patience. She spoke with the tremulous sincerity of someone who wished desperately to be believed. She said she had heard an argument the night before Wells died, the bursar's voice, sharp and full of bitterness, echoing through the courtyard. Rowan had told her to ignore it, but she couldn't. While she described the scene, her fingers traced the outline of a quotation scribbled in the margin of the book before her. I leaned closer. It was a misremembered line from Hardy, subtly altered, and in that small alteration I sensed her state of mind more clearly than in anything she said aloud. Lewis, ever the more charitable of us, whispered that this might be the break we needed. Caldecott's financial irregularities had already been the subject of quiet rumor, and there was something almost too perfect in the alignment of his resentment, the missing keys, and the frayed relationship between him and Wells. When we confronted him in his office, he wore the expression of a man rehearsing indignation, his hand hovering protectively over a ledger he claimed was routine accounting. His stories came too easily, each sentence polished by haste, and I felt that unreliable comfort one experiences when all the pieces of the puzzle seem to fall neatly into place. He insisted Wells had been threatening to expose minor mismanagement. Nothing criminal, only embarrassing. He said Wells had grown erratic in recent weeks, making unfounded accusations. While he spoke, I watched a bead of perspiration gather at his temple despite the coolness of the room. There is something revealing in the way a man sweats when faced not with guilt, but with the fear of being misunderstood. Lewis murmured later that it was clear enough Caldecott had been cornered and had lashed out. The tidy logic of it appealed even to me for a moment, the simple arithmetic of motive and opportunity. Yet doubt has a habit of whispering at the edges of confidence. As we left his office, I paused beside a row of photographs lining the corridor. The older ones, in sepia fading toward oblivion, seemed to contain shadows that did not belong to the people captured there. One frame hung slightly crooked, and when I adjusted it, I noticed a faint smear of blue chalk along its lower edge. Not enough to accuse, barely enough to notice, yet its presence threaded unease through my thoughts. Lewis suggested we take lunch, perhaps walk through the Bodleian to clear our minds. I told him the Bodleian never cleared anything. It only magnified. Instead, we returned to the quad, where the chalk lines had begun to re-emerge as the ground dried. For the first time, the pattern seemed to hint at completion. A compass point, a fractured symmetry, something with intention rather than randomness. I stood there, letting the cold settle around me, and felt that particular kind of dread that arrives when a false solution is almost convincing enough to seduce. The lie was beautiful. Yes. The bursa, the quarrel, the threat of exposure. A motive wrapped in embarrassment, the sort of misfortune academia specializes in producing. But as I traced the chalk lines with my eyes, I felt the pull of something quieter, something that refused to bend to the narrative being offered. A misquoted poem, a trembling gesture, a pattern disguised as disorder. Lewis asked if I believed the case against Caldecott. I told him belief is a dangerous luxury in our work, and that beauty, even in deception, has a way of clouding judgment. He looked at me as though waiting for something more, but I had no explanation to give. Only a stubborn certainty, or perhaps merely instinct, that the truth had not yet shown its face. The red herring was elegant enough to admire, but not, I suspected, to trust. Some discoveries arrive not with fanfare, but with a softness that unsettles more deeply than shock. It was Lewis who found the photograph, though he tried to pretend it was of little consequence. We stood in the porter's modest quarters that afternoon, the faint smell of polish lingering in the air like a habit. Rain tapped at the single window with the quiet persistence of an unanswered question. Lewis held the photograph delicately, as if the past it contained might splinter under the weight of attention. He passed it to me without comment. A college group from the early 90s, arranged in the stiff formality of an era that still believed in such rituals. Wells appeared at the edge, younger, brighter-eyed, wearing an expression that suggested he had not yet learned to swallow disappointment without complaint. Beside him stood a young woman whose face had been scratched out with the deliberateness of anger rather than accident. The erasure had been done long ago. The paper bore the faint abrasions of repeated attempts to remove her. The absence of her features demanded more attention than their presence ever could. I traced the blank oval with my thumb. Beneath the surface, the paper felt wounded. Lewis murmured that the names were printed on the back. I read them once. Then again, one name had been crossed through and overwritten with smaller, more hesitant handwriting. It was a detail easy enough to miss, yet it pulsed with the insistence of a forgotten memory. The overwritten name matched the entry altered in the torn register page we had found in Wells's coat. Patterns seldom announce themselves loudly. They whisper from the margins. We spoke with Dr. Harriet Vane Foster later in the day. She greeted us with a calmness that felt too polished, like someone who had rehearsed her breathing. I watched her gaze drift toward the photograph the moment she saw it, though she made no admission. She said she recognized some of the faces, but her voice carried a tension that contradicted the mildness of her words. While she talked, her hand brushed the edge of a book on her desk, lingering a second too long, as though she reached unconsciously for something to steady herself. I asked her about the woman whose face had been erased. She hesitated, not the hesitation of forgetting, but the kind that comes from choosing between truth and self-preservation. She said only that the woman had left the college abruptly. Academic difficulties, she claimed. Personal matters. The euphemisms adults use when they wish the young to disappear quietly. I watched the faint tremor in her fingers and felt again that sense of a story compressed into silence. After leaving her rooms, Lewis and I walked the cloister in a grey light that felt older than the stones it touched. I asked him to read the names from the back of the photograph. He did so, and something in the cadence made me aware of what had been troubling me. The name that had been rewritten did not match the alphabetical sequence of the list. Someone had taken care to maintain the order while disguising the substitution as a small deception, nearly invisible, but never pointless. Lewis said I was reading too much into scratches and ink. I told him scratches and ink have undone more lives than violence ever managed. He sighed in that way he does when he thinks I am drifting toward abstraction, yet I saw the flicker of uncertainty cross his features. Even the practical lose their footing when confronted with the persistence of the past. We returned to Wells's room. The evening had sunk into that soft hour when everything seemed unfinished. I searched through a drawer beneath the narrow bed and found a thin notebook. Not a diary. Wells had never struck me as sentimental, but a collection of small observations, written without dates. A line repeated several times caught my attention and remembered the old map. Beneath it, a sketch so faint it looked like a ghost drawing the outline of the quad as it had once been, before renovation. As the light dimmed, I held the notebook, the photograph, and the memory of the chalk lines in my mind, letting them circle one another like pieces of a puzzle refusing to fit. The scratched-out face lingered with particular weight. Whoever she was, her absence had carved its shape through the years, leaving a vacancy no amount of ink could disguise. Lewis asked what I thought it meant. I told him I wasn't certain. But truths buried in photographs have a way of resurfacing, and I felt, with a quiet heaviness, that this one was already rising toward us through the chalk-drawn geometry of the past. By the time we reached the midpoint of the investigation, the case had begun to assemble itself with that deceptive coherence that lures even the wary into premature certainty. It was late afternoon, the kind of muted hour when Oxford seems to draw its breath in preparation for nothing in particular. Lewis and I stood beneath the archway overlooking the quad, the chalk lines now faint, the rain having thinned them into near memory. He said the pieces were aligning at last. I told him alignment was often the most dangerous illusion. Cecily's testimony, Caldecott's evasions, the quarrel overheard on the night Wells died, each thread curled pleasingly around the next, forming a narrative attractive in its simplicity. The bursar had motive, opportunity, and the brittle temperament of a man cornered by shame. Even the financial irregularities, once dismissed as minor inconsistencies, now appeared as a foundation of resentment. Lewis repeated that Wells must have confronted him, pushed him too far. His voice carried that instinctive confidence he takes care never to display too loudly, as though loudness might wake the truth and summon its disapproval. We called Caldecott into one of the small conference rooms off the library cloister. The place smelled of cold stone and unclaimed essays, the air sharp with old paper. He entered with a stiffness that bordered on theatrical. When I asked him to recount his movements again, his narrative flowed too easily, the seamlessness of a man who had practiced his lines. A detail caught me, his insistence that he had seen Wells locking the chapel doors at 7 in the evening. Yet I remembered the sexton telling us almost apologetically, that he had done it himself on both nights that week. It was a small inconsistency, almost forgivable, yet it lingered in my mind like a quiet dissonance in an otherwise harmonious chord. Lewis pressed him about the quarrel. Caldecott denied it with a contempt too polished to be entirely genuine. His hands fidgeted in small, repetitive movements, the kind of gestures people make when calculating the boundaries of their lies. I watched the narrowing of his eyes, the tightening around his mouth, and for a moment, only a moment, I felt the seduction of certainty. It would have been easy, even comfortable, to let the case rest on him. The college authorities would accept it. Strange would commend the efficiency, and I could retreat into some melancholy reflection about ambition and frailty, pour myself a whiskey, and call it a day. But it was the ease that troubled me. Cases rarely close themselves so obligingly. After we dismissed him, Lewis suggested we prepare the preliminary report. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I walked toward the far corner of the quad, where the chalk lines were almost invisible in the evening light. I crouched and studied the faintest remnant of a curve that seemed to connect 2 points with a precision that defied the assumption of childish doodling. The line matched a forgotten boundary I'd glimpsed in the old quad photographs, the same ones in Wells's notebook. It was not evidence, not yet, but it tugged at me with stubborn insistence. Lewis approached quietly. He said the case felt ready to fall into place. I told him readiness was often an invention of tired minds. He looked puzzled, perhaps frustrated, but he said nothing more. The false solution hovered there between us, elegant, plausible, aching to be believed. Yet I felt the quiet unease that comes when the heart of a case remains hidden behind a truth too convenient to trust. Caldecott fit the story, yes, but crimes rarely fit their culprits so neatly. Human frailty is messier, more evasive, more resistant to the tidy explanations we try to force upon it. As the light thinned to dusk, I stood alone on the stones, the faint geometry of chalk at my feet like a whisper half heard. I knew then that we were standing before a curtain, not a conclusion, and somewhere behind it the real story waited with the patience of something that understood the cost of being found. It was just after dawn when I returned to the quad alone, the air sharp with that particular chill Oxford reserves for mornings when something uninvited is about to surface. The stones glimmered faintly beneath the thin sheen left by the night's drizzle. I walked without urgency, the way one approaches a memory one has not decided whether to trust. The chalk lines, so fragile the day before, had shifted again in the light. Not grown chalk does not grow, but clarified, as if the weather had conspired to strip away the noise and leave only the intention. One curved line in particular caught my attention. It had been nearly erased the previous evening, yet now it stood out in a pale streak unmarred by the damp. I crouched beside it, the cold sinking into my knees, and touched the edge of the marking. The powder lifted onto my fingertip with a freshness that denied its supposed age. Someone had been here in the night, redrawing what the weather had tried to erase. It was a quiet claim of ownership, a silent insistence that this map, whatever its purpose, must remain legible. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, yawning into the sleeve of his coat. He muttered something about early starts and unreasonable stone surfaces, but his voice softened when he saw what I was studying. He asked if I thought the chalk was guiding us somewhere. I told him chalk doesn't guide so much as exposing it reveals who fears being forgotten. His expression suggested he wasn't sure whether I was being poetic or simply irritable. I wasn't sure either. We followed the line toward the chapel steps. The chalk thickened there, not in bold strokes but in careful repetitions, as though the drawer had redrawn the same angle multiple times to ensure accuracy. I stepped back, letting my eyes adjust to the pattern. It was not random, nor even artistic. It formed the sight line between several specific windows around the quad. every carefully preserved chalk segment aligned with a vantage point from which someone could watch without being seen. Lewis said that was fanciful. I told him observation is the least fanciful act humans inflict upon one another. Inside the lodge, we found the sexton sweeping the floor. When I asked whether he had noticed anyone walking the quad late at night, he hesitated a small pause, the kind that stretches longer in memory than in reality. He finally said he had glimpsed a woman near the chapel window the night before. Wells died. He hadn't called out to her because she seemed lost in thought. He said she looked familiar, though he couldn't place her. I could. The faint blue smudge on Harriet Vane Foster's skirt. The way her eyes had darkened when she saw the old photograph. The tightness in her voice when we spoke of the erased woman. Lewis said it didn't prove anything. I agreed proof is too blunt a tool for moments like these, but deduction often begins with the delicate weight of something recognized but unspoken. We went to speak with her again. She opened the door with the tension of someone expecting unwelcome company. Her hair was slightly disheveled, as though morning had not yet decided how it meant to treat her. She asked whether there had been some development. I told her we had a few questions about the photograph, the map, the chalk, and the night she said she had been asleep. Her composure faltered. Not broken, merely rearranged. She said she sometimes walked the quad late at night to quiet her thoughts. She spoke too quickly, then corrected herself with a steadiness she did not possess a moment earlier. That contradiction, that brief fracture, revealed more than any confession could. While she talked, I noticed the sleeve of her cardigan brush the edge of her bookcase, leaving behind the faintest dusting of blue. It was a tiny thing, a trace so small it might have been imagined. Yet I felt the slow click of intuition settling into place, aligning itself with the chalk beneath our feet. When we left her room, Lewis asked if I thought she was hiding something. I told him everyone hides something, but only a few redraw their secrets onto the stones of an old quad in the middle of the night. As we stepped into the open air again, the chalk lines shimmered under the lifting sky, pale but insistent. They weren't just markings now. They were a message quiet, trembling, and unmistakably personal, and at last I felt certain of one thing. Someone had tried very hard to preserve a truth that had been buried for decades, and another person had died because of it. There are times in an investigation when the world seems to hold its breath, as though waiting for one small, stubborn truth to surface. That morning carried that strange stillness. Oxford lay beneath a colorless sky, the quiet heavy enough to press upon the mind. Lewis and I walked back toward the porter's lodge, neither of us speaking. There are silences that reveal more than conversation ever could, and I felt an unease running beneath his calm like an undertow. We stepped inside the lodge, the air faintly scented with old fabric and the ghost of tobacco. Wells's belongings had been boxed with a kind of efficient indifference. I asked Lewis to leave me for a few minutes. There are some discoveries a man must make without an audience. I opened the top box, half expecting nothing more than the mundane remnants of an unremarkable life. Instead, I found a blazer folded neatly, its fabric worn but cared for. When I lifted it, a thin cloud of chalk dust drifted into the air, pale against the dim light. Chalk. Not from the stones outside. This dust was finer, softer, the residue of repeated handling, as though Wells had brushed against the blue lines again and again, or redrawn them. I set the blazer aside and reached for the notebook we had found days earlier. I read the line that had nagged at me ever since I remembered the old map. Only now did the phrasing trouble me in a new way. Not found. Remember. A word that implies prior knowledge, not discovery. Wells hadn't been deciphering something new. He had been retrieving something long buried. Lewis returned then, saying Strange wanted an update. I told him we had none worth reporting. He sighed, the sound carrying frustration rather than fatigue. But I felt a shift in the movement of thought at the edges of clarity, like the first glimpse of an image hidden beneath warped glass. We walked back into the quad. The chalk remnants seemed almost deliberate now, their persistence unsettling. I stopped near the chapel steps, where the lines intersected at odd angles. The stones were damp but untouched. I asked Lewis whether he noticed anything unusual about the pattern. He said only that it looked like a child's maze. I told him children rarely build mazes that reflect architectural history. He frowned, and I could see the irritation forming that look he gives when he suspects I am following an invisible thread. I stepped back, lowering myself until my eyeline matched the angle of the chalk. Then I saw the marks aligned perfectly with the blind spots in the quad's modern CCTV layout. The chalk marked where the cameras could not see where they had never been able to see. Lewis asked softly whether I was suggesting Wells had mapped the quad to hide someone's movements. I told him I was suggesting someone had used Wells' knowledge of the quad to hide their own. We returned to Harriet's rooms. She opened the door quickly, as though she had been waiting. Her face carried the fragile calm of someone who has spent the night rehearsing steadiness. She asked whether we had made progress. I said only that we had found the old photograph again. Her fingers tightened on the doorknob. A small gesture, but revealing. I watched her eyes when I mentioned the erased woman's name. Her composure wavered, then reassembled with painful precision. She said the past was complicated. I replied that the past rarely kills a man unless someone drags it back into daylight. A silence followed, one thick enough to cut through. Her gaze drifted toward the quad, the faintest tremor in her posture. When we left, Lewis whispered that she seemed frightened. I told him fear often walks hand in hand with guilt, but also with truth. The challenge lay in telling which companion she held more tightly. The turning point arrived not with a revelation, but with the sound of the chapel bell striking the hour with a resonance that trembled through the stones. In its vibration, something fell into place in my mind. Wells had not been leading us to the killer. He had been leading us to the reason. The detail everyone missed was that the chalk map was not pointing outward, but inward, back toward Harriet, her sister, and the night the truth had first been buried. And now someone has dug it up again. As the bell's final note faded, I felt the weight of the truth settle. The invisible line the chalk had drawn had finally reached its end. It was late afternoon when I asked Harriet Vane Foster to walk with me across the quad. The light had thinned into that pale, brittle gold one only sees in Oxford during the colder months, when even the sun seems reluctant to touch the stones. She agreed without protest, though something in the way she closed her door suggested she knew precisely why I had come. We walked in silence at first, our footsteps muffled by the lingering damp. The chalk lines, now faint as breath on glass, trailed between us like the remnants of a language only one of us truly understood. She asked whether there had been a development in the case. I told her developments are rarely born in sudden clarity. They emerge from the quiet friction between what is said and what is suffered. Her expression tightened, not in fear, but in resignation. I had seen that look before in people who already know the answer but are waiting to be told. We stopped near the chapel wall, where a single line of chalk remained untouched by rain. I watched her eyes settle on it with a tenderness that startled me. She said her sister used to draw maps like that when they were students, little puzzles meant to amuse the mind. I reminded her that the woman in the photograph had not been merely a passing memory. Someone had tried very hard to erase her. Harriet flinched as though I had spoken a name she had spent years avoiding. She said softly that her sister had been troubled, misunderstood, and vulnerable. The kind of vulnerability that clever men sometimes mistake for invitation. I let the silence follow, not out of cruelty, but because silence can open doors where questions fail. At last, she admitted what we had both known since the photograph resurfaced. Her sister had filed a complaint that the college quietly extinguished. Wells had been the only person who tried to help, offering her ways to avoid the places where danger lurked. When she left Oxford abruptly, she had left behind a wound no amount of scholarship could cauterize. Lewis waited by the entrance to the cloisters, far enough not to intrude. I saw the question in his stance, the one he hoped I would answer for him so he wouldn't need to confront it himself. But some truths belong only to those forced to carry them. Harriet's voice thinned as she spoke of the night Wells died. She had come across him unexpectedly, she said, standing near the old quad's boundary lines. He told her he intended to speak to someone, perhaps a reporter, perhaps a trustee, about the past, about the man who had hurt her sister and had since become a decorated academic. She asked him not to. She couldn't bear the idea of her sister's name being dragged through old corridors again. The argument had escalated. Wells stepped back, his foot slipping on the slick stone. The fall was not dramatic. Some tragedies choose smallness. She said she redrew the chalk later that night because she couldn't sleep. The lines reminded her of childhood puzzles, of a time before everything she loved became blurred by harm. She hadn't meant to mislead us. She just wanted the pattern to remain, a fragile attempt to hold on to something that once made sense. Lewis approached then, quietly, as though afraid to break the fragile thread of the confession. Harriet asked whether she was being arrested. I told her not yet. I told her the truth is not a single act, but a long echo, and some echoes can't be silenced by procedure. She nodded, as though she had expected nothing else. As we walked her toward the lodge, the wind lifted the remaining chalk dust into the air, scattering it across the quad in pale whispers. It faded even as we watched, until only the memory of its geometry remained. Long after she had been taken away, I stood alone on the stones. The sky had darkened into a blue that felt almost bruised. I listened to the quiet, the kind that settles after a story has passed itself, and felt a heaviness I could not name. Not sorrow exactly, not relief either. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that some confessions arrive so softly, one almost misses the sound. The quad, emptied of chalk and shadow, looked peaceful again. But peace, I have learned, is often the final disguise worn by truth once it has finished its work.